Welcome to Brain Friendly Lecturing and the Savvy Use of PowerPoint for Fire Service Instructors. I'm going to get going in a minute, but first I want you to grab a sheet of paper and make two columns for me. In the first column, I want you to make me a list of everything you already know about how to lecture and how PowerPoints ought to be constructed. In the second column, I want you to make me a list of everything you hope to learn from today's lecture about lecturing in PowerPoint. Make me a list of things you want to know about PowerPoint and lecturing. So the agenda for this PowerPoint on brain-friendly lecturing and effective PowerPoint will be these four areas. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of information I like to call brain fun facts, just a little background on how the brain actually learns. Then I'm going to give you a few pointers about how you can build more brain-friendly lectures using what you now know about brain research. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to design a good, solid PowerPoint. And then I'll give you just a few final thoughts and a few more helpful hints. As many of you alluded to in your earlier discussion post, you learn best when there's some immediate reason for you to learn the information. There's some way that you are able to make connections between the new information coming in and existing information that's stored somewhere else in your brain. This is also what the brain research says, that if you are able to help students make connections between the new information and information that's already in their brain somewhere, this will make it easier to learn, and this will also help students really retain the information. One of the things we know for sure is that when we ask students to memorize things just using rote memorization, that information can be retained temporarily, say for an OSFM exam, but it isn't really deep learning, kind of permanent, fixed in your craw kind of learning that we really want students to walk away with. The other thing about your brain is you learn best through multiple exposures to the information being presented. So this is also why you want to think about how to have students learn the concept in the classroom part of your show, and then also practice applying it maybe with a tabletop activity, but then also you do a practical. So students' brains get multiple exposure to the content that you're trying to teach. So then, in keeping with what we know about brain research, a brain-friendly lecture needs to have three elements. The first is that you need to basically prep the brain, warm the brain up. What you want to do here then is to ask students to think about all the information that is already in their head about the topic or a related topic that you're going to be discussing in your lecture that night. You then also want to find a way to engage the brain throughout the discussion, and then finally provide application opportunities so that students, again, get multiple exposure and then actually time practicing applying the information. To prep the brain, it does not have to be anything long. It can be something very simple and should take maybe 20 seconds off the top of your lecture. And that is usually best done through some kind of introduction activity. Over the years, I think faculty have experimented with a variety of these kind of brain prep possibilities. I just wanted to mention four that I think have some real possibilities, particularly in fire service. The first is this idea called a quick write, where you basically ask the students a question for them to reflect on about the information you're going to be providing. And it can either be something formal where students actually write it down and then you maybe collect it later, evaluate it, use it for points, say, if you're actually teaching a class at the college, or it can be something just a little less formal, but ideally it's some question to kind of, again, bring whatever background knowledge is already in students' heads to kind of the front of their mind so that they're nice and warmed up when you go to work with the new information. The second thing you could try is a questionnaire or an opinionaire, again, where you ask students a few questions and then ask them for opinions on specific topics or equipment. You could ask them questionnaires about how much experience they have with a given piece of equipment. You could also do a case study where you present, something from the fire service and then ask students to think about what their answer would be to this particular case. And again, this is before you've done your lecture. You could then come back to this case at the end of your lecture and then ask students to reevaluate it now that they've gotten the lecture information, and then use this as kind of a pre and post test benchmarking item to see what your students have really learned since they came in the door. And then the final thing you could do is a video clip where you just kind of show, the process you're going to be describing, or an event where your students might need to know the item that you're going to be discussing that night. So any of these 4 things work in terms of just kind of warming up students' brains. There are a lot of resources out there online that you can use as your brain prep, but I want to just mention 2. I know you guys are familiar with YouTube. There is a sister site called tubechop.com where you can actually take the URL from YouTube and then cut it down to whatever the section of the video is that you want to watch. So if you don't actually want folks to watch 5 minutes of an event until you actually get to the last 30 seconds where you really want them to see what happens, you can take that URL, go to tubechop.com, and then chop it down to just those last 30, and then it gives you a fresh URL to use in your lesson. I'm a huge fan of the TubeChop. The other thing I just wanted to mention was Fire Engineering has an iPhone app, but they also have this online simulation site as part of their web page, and there are a lot of different scenarios you could do there, also just as kind of a preview to ask folks to think about whatever the scenario is you're going to be looking at in training that night. So now that you've prepped the brain, now you're going to engage the brain. So the first thing you want to do is introduce the topic or topics for your lecture. And to do this, you should provide at least the first 2 things. The third thing I think is a little bit of an option. So first, you want to provide an opening summary about what you're going to discuss over the course of your lecture. The way you also want to do that is by providing a few kind of big topic headlines for students to hang on to as they're moving through your lecture. You want to do this again as a way to kind of provide a verbal outline, if you will, for students to follow as you're lecturing. The third thing you can provide, which a lot of students do find helpful, is to provide an example or an analogy at the beginning that will be relevant as you continue through your lecture. Something that functions as kind of a touchstone as you move through the lecture. You continue to refer back to this example or this analogy as another way, again, to help students follow along in a verbal lecture. So as an example, in my introduction today, I talked about that brain-friendly lectures have these 3 parts, right? So these were kind of my big headline items, that we were going to talk about brain prep, how to engage the brain, and then how to provide opportunities for application. So that you know where I'm going, you've got a little roadmap of where the lecture is going to take you next. During your lecture, you want to keep a few things in mind to keep brains engaged. The first thing is that you want to lecture in no more than 20-minute chunks maximum. So you need to think of this as warm up the brain, then do your lecture, and then do an application item. The lecture part in the middle is what I'm talking about, the 20-minute max part being. So you want to give students these kind of mini lectures instead of droning on for 2 or 3 hours, or even, frankly, 50 minutes, a little too much. So think about how you can carve up your material into 20-minute chunks that you kind of sandwich on either side with warming up the brain and then applying the material. Also, as you're doing the lecture, you want to do what we call assign a listening role to students, where you ask them to listen for specific kinds of things. I'll come back to that in a second. You can also use one of these other tasks, like asking students to take notes, but you're going to actually provide a format for them to use to help them with the note-taking. I think we've all struggled at some point in our academic career with figuring out what the best system is to take notes, what really works for us. I'm going to give you a few formats that you can show students, and you can kind of think about how to help them capture your material in your lecture the best way that you feel will help them as they try to learn the material and then study eventually for, let's say, an OSFM exam. And then finally, a wrap task is kind of a precursor to the application task, where basically it gives students a chance to attempt whatever you're going to ask them to do in the application part of the show, but this will actually be something you can do as a group or with small groups to kind of get students thinking about, okay, this is really how we're going to work the application part. But again, it's kind of a slightly more low risk because it's something that you're still doing as a group kind of learning experience. When you're assigning a listening role to students, it's as simple as saying to students, please listen for cause and effect in the following lecture, or please listen for any of these other items, a chain of event, a sequence, or a process to doing something. I know a lot of you were looking at SCBA, so if you were doing a lecture, you could say, like, please listen to the sequence for, donning and doffing SCBA. And then, again, you could also ask students to listen to vocabulary that's going to be new for them. So it can be as easy as any of these things, just asking students to listen for and then kind of fill in the blank, what you want them to really attend to as you're instructing them. To guide students' note-taking, what you're really doing is providing a structure. I think we've all been there where we ask students to please take notes and you don't see a whole lot of pencils moving, and then later you see a whole lot of flunking on quizzes. So what I would say is that you need to help students figure out what's a good way to take notes. These couple of places online have a few graphic organizer samples that you can look at and modify that might work for what you're trying to teach. I'm going to show you in this next slide a couple things that I've used that I've found pretty effective. Well, if you haven't figured out this about me, I do love structure. So for me, guided note-taking in a grid really suits how I operate. So this is actually a grid I used in one of my classes where we were discussing the differences between communism, socialism, and capitalism, and how those three different economic structures look at personal property and wealth. So what I asked my students to do was to fill in this grid as I was lecturing about these ideas. The great thing about the grid is if a student missed what I was saying about communism as it relates to personal property, that box would stay blank, and at the end of my lecture, that student knew that was the missing piece, and he or she could just raise the hand and say, hey, I didn't get that, could you go over communism and personal property? So I like the grid because I feel like it's a really great visual for students about what they got out of your lecture and what they still need you to review with them. This is another T-chart simple grid that I enjoy using with my students also, where we're looking at something like cause and effect, where on the left side, students write down the various causes, and on the right side, they write down the effects. It's a pretty simple thing to do, but when you think about it, this is kind of a hard thing to take notes on, because other than actually writing down cause and effect and drawing the arrows and things like that, how are you really supposed to capture this information? So I feel like sometimes if you can just help students think through ways to capture the information, they'll do a much better job taking notes. But you're not born into the world knowing how to take notes. Somebody really needs to teach you. So to me, these easy graphic organizers are a way that you can help your students figure that out. So at the end of your lecture, you want to do some kind of a wrap task where you're basically asking students to look back again at the information that you've presented. Now, for me, in an English class, I could have students reread a specific passage, let's say. You could also have your students revisit your brain prep item again, or do a post questionnaire. You can cycle the information back around to however you began your lecture, and that's always a nice way to kind of segue into the application part. Or like I said, I also like doing something that's kind of a practice version of the application piece I'm going to ask students to do, so that at least we have an experience as trying it as a whole group before I ask them to do it individually or even in pairs. As an example, this is a wrap task I did when I was going over the Bill of Rights with my students. And I had done this actually as our warm-up activity too, as I had asked them to look over the amendments and then rank them in terms of the most important and the least important. And then I had them revisit that again at the end of the lecture once we'd had a little bit of time to talk about the Bill of Rights and kind of what each of the amendments was all about. So at the end of your 20 minutes of lecturing, you're going to want to provide an application item post your lecture to have students really practice whatever the concept is that you've been lecturing on. There are a few different ways to do this. One of them is to have the students basically have a discussion about the content that you've presented. You can either do that as a whole group or you can divide students up into smaller groups. I think depending on the group of students, you can figure out which way is going to be the most productive. You could also, again, provide another case problem or a case study or do some kind of experiential activity, which I think for fire service is probably a practical, hands-on element. So when it comes to where you can find application sources, you can always go back to my list for the brain prep sources online. Plus, anything from your current work experience or current events, you can always modify and use those kinds of things. Usually also the textbooks that we use, especially here for classes at the college, come with a lot of supplements. I know Rich talked a little bit in one of his posts about the quiz generator item, but usually embedded with all that stuff are other kinds of case study items and other study guides and things like that. So you can always look at what the publisher is offering and then, again, modify it. You don't ever have to use anything just as complete boilerplate the way it comes from the original source.